Kicking off the final stage of their offseason program, the Seahawks opened mandatory minicamp at the VMAC on Tuesday. What went down on offense, defense, and special teams? We're going to be taking a deep dive on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in, whether you're down in Fort Worth, Texas, in the land of the Cowboys, or overseas in Paris, France. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Kicking off their final step in the offseason program, the Seahawks opened a mandatory minicamp today at the VMAC. We're going to be taking a deep dive into all of our takeaways. Rob, you and I were both in attendance today at the VMAC, so plenty of takeaways, observations coming out of the first of 3 mandatory minicamp practices. And we'll be talking about a new trend starting in training camp that's finally coming to Seattle, heading to Nashville for some joint practices, and we'll be discussing the significance of that. This episode is brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Finishing off their first offseason program under new coach Mike Macdonald, the Seahawks opened the first of 3 sessions for their mandatory minicamp at the VMAC on Tuesday. The same tempo, the same rules as OTAs, but the big difference, Rob, we get to see all of the Seahawks be there, at least the ones that are healthy enough to participate. The ones that aren't were there for the most part as well. The mandatory minicamp aspect, you're going to see a lot of players like Draymond Jones that ended up making their return to the Pacific Northwest and were on the practice field on Tuesday. But rather than talk about specific players looking at this first day of OTAs, this felt like we were out in mid-November watching a practice, not mid-June, with the wind chill, gusts above 30 miles per hour on the practice field. Really, the number one player on the field today was none other than Mother Nature wreaking havoc, particularly on the passing game.
No, it really was a factor. As you said, Corbin, you and I were both there. I saw a lot of fluttery passes from Seattle's quarterbacks, both Geno Smith and Sam Howell. PJ Walker got a couple of throws in there. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But there was a lot of fluttery passes out there. The defense was dominating when they were doing some punt return drills. Again, I saw some of Seattle's returners struggle with tracking the ball. And so I think that is something that we have to mention here right off the bat, is that if you're going to be reading or hearing about some are going to say that the defense dominated this today's mandatory minicamp practice, and I think that you can make an argument that was the case. But as you said, the wind basically wreaked havoc with everything, and that played such a huge role that I think that you have to kind of take those takeaways with a bit of a grain of salt, and instead kind of focus in on where Seattle was lining players up, who was actually there in attendance. As you said, it was mandatory. When the coach says mandatory, then you and I are both going to be there, of course. And so that to me was one of the more interesting things is, again, the fact that Draymond Jones was back on the field for the Seahawks, the fact that, Geno Smith didn't have his greatest day. But again, I think more of that was because of the wind and some particularly impressive defensive plays that I think they are going to have Seahawks fans pretty fired up about what the future might lie with the Mike Macdonald defense.
This was definitely the best example of turnover Tuesday so far in the Mike Macdonald era, and he's hoping that that's going to be something that they see frequently. I don't know that the Seahawks are going to be practicing on Tuesdays, but still, Pete Carroll era, that's not what they did. But nonetheless, the turnover fest that we saw today, a lot of it was wind-inflicted, as you mentioned, so maybe take it a little bit of a grain of salt, but don't take away from the plays that were made on the practice field. And there were 2 plays in particular that you and I were talking about before the show coming out of practice that we felt stood out above the rest. And one was in 7-on-7, one was during the 11-on-11 team session. I want to start with the one in 11-on-11 because there's been so much talk, especially on this podcast, dating back to March when Bobby Wagner and Jordan Brooks left, and then Tyrell Dodson, Jerome Baker signed in free agency, that the Seahawks were going to have two big gaps they needed to fill at linebacker. And we still don't have Tyrell Dodson or Jerome Baker on the practice field participating. Doesn't sound like either one of them is going to be ready until training camp gets rolling in late July. And so that has afforded Jon Rhattigan, above all other returning linebackers, the opportunity to impress. And he had one heck of an interception today. Geno Smith trying to thread the needle over the middle to Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Rhattigan got his left hand on the ball and knocked the ball up in the air. Then he juggled it a couple times and then ended up corralling the football for an interception. It was a fantastic pick, dropping back in zone coverage. Great awareness by him. I don't know if there's a player that is benefiting more from the absence of Baker and Dodson right now than Jon Rhattigan, because he's in year 4. He has gotten very limited opportunities to play on defense, but he's been a special teams core player to this point, and he seems to be catching Mike Macdonald's attention. And the other play, I know this is the one that you are going to want to gush about in 7-on-7, Trey Brown going up against DK Metcalf and making one hell of an interception during that segment that drew some oohs and ahs from teammates on the sideline.
Yeah, I was in a really good position just to kind of watch that play. And it was a beautifully thrown ball from Geno Smith to DK Metcalf, as you said. The ball was kind of floating. It was a deep ball over the top. DK could have made the play, but right as he was about to collect the ball, Trey Brown slapped at the ball. It forced the ball up into the air, and Trey Brown snatched it out of the air and turned around and basically ran back for what would have been a touchdown. It was a spectacular demonstration of Trey Brown's kind of big play. Trey Brown kind of what he has shown in the past. And it was also, again, a terrific example of Geno Smith's accuracy when the wind died down for a couple of moments. But again, to me, it was one of those plays that really demonstrated the ball hawking skills that intrigued the Seahawks about Trey Brown in the first place. And I think the playmaking ability that Mike Macdonald is looking to just kind of coax out of a Seattle secondary that is talented and has been talented for a long time. Obviously has some new names in the safety position. But to me, one of the most intriguing things is just the way that the fact that Trey Brown was able to actually turn a possible interception into points for the defense, similar to the way that Jon Rhattigan was able to kind of pull in that pass. And you mentioned, I mean, Jon Rhattigan has been able to, take advantage of these opportunities, as is Patrick O'Connell. He had a couple of pass breakups during this workout as well. And so again, to me, that was one of the most exciting takeaways is the entire process is that these are some players that don't necessarily have quite as much buzz as a Devin Witherspoon, as a Tyrell Dodson, and Jerome Baker, who, by the way, both of those players I was able to confirm have been attending everything. They're just not healthy enough to actually be on the field for the Seahawks. But they, again, any people who are out there criticizing the Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker, again, they are there. And the fact that the Seahawks safeties are lining up their corners effectively and they're all able to make plays to me, is all the reason why to believe that Mike Macdonald's defense is going to be able to continue its playmaking success that he had in Baltimore and previously at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out the other thing that jumped out today as well. These OTAs and minicamp practices, with non-contact, with not having pads on, there's a lot of limitations in terms of evaluation. But when you've got a new coaching staff, you're looking at positional usage and how personnel is being deployed. And with Draymond Jones being there today for the first time, you finally got a full glimpse at what Seattle may be able to do with this defensive line. And this is just me personally, and I asked Mike Macdonald about this after practice. I love the fact that we are seeing Jarran Reed and Leonard Williams, who are both over 300 pounds, that we are seeing these guys not only play inside, but they're also playing the big end position. Even Leonard Williams today had a couple times, Rob, I was chuckling about it, but he looked pretty good doing it, where he was in a 2-point stance outside of the tackle. Not something I anticipate is going to be done very often, but at the same time, that is the rare flexibility you have with a couple of these big guys. Draymond Jones can play inside and out, not quite as big, but still 280 plus pounds. Being able to play 3-tech, big end, outside linebacker, it really does open up the playbook in terms of what the Seahawks can be able to do. So that was something without seeing actual plays happen off of it, but just seeing the scheme, the formation that got me buzzing, because it shows you all the different options that the Seahawks have at their disposal. They're going to be able to experiment with getting this rotation right with all these veterans up front.
Yeah, no question about it. And that was, again, one of the things that I loved about it as well is just the fact that Seattle clearly is excited about, say, a Byron Murphy II or a Christian Haynes. But at the same time, they're going to have to earn their opportunities here. And so to see Seattle kind of start off with their starting defensive line basically being Jarran Reed, at a defensive end role in a traditional 3-4 defense. But Jarran Reed, Jonathan Hankins, and Leonard Williams is your starting three, and then Byron Murphy comes in as a backup as a defensive end. The same thing with Byron Murphy the second. I mean, that to me is exactly the type of rotation that we've seen Mike Macdonald have so much success with in the past. And so again, I'm excited about where this defense is going and the talent that it has on the field.
When we come back, we're going to continue diving into takeaways from Tuesday's first mandatory minicamp practice. We're going to go to the offensive side of the football. There wasn't a lot of offensive fireworks, and yet there's plenty to discuss. Some newcomers that were on the practice field for the first time, some under contract, some not. And we're also going to be looking at a few second-team players that might be starting to make a little bit of noise here during minicamp. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, the Stanley Cup, and much more, and you can bet on it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200, win or lose. Is Jaylen Brown now the favorite to win NBA Finals MVP? Is Aaron Judge going to have another home run coming up tonight for the Yankees? Or will Connor McDavid score at least one goal to help the Oilers climb out of a 2-0 hole in the Stanley Cup? You can bet on it all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks now in the final step of their offseason program, the first one under new coach Mike Macdonald, opening mandatory minicamp today. As we just discussed, Rob, this was a weather implicated practice. I mean, you had all kinds of crazy stuff going on with the wind out there on the field. Felt like there was more dead ducks than spirals, and I'm not blaming the quarterbacks. It just was not an ideal situation conditions-wise to be able to throw the football, and yet that doesn't mean there weren't a few things that jumped out as positives or intriguing tidbits on the offensive side of the football, most notably a few of the newcomers that were in uniform today. As you mentioned earlier, PJ Walker getting his first practice with the Seahawks, and Mike Macdonald certainly sounds excited about adding him to the mix behind Geno Smith and Sam Howell, another athletic quarterback that obviously first practice, not a lot of reps for him. He's trying to learn this offense and trying to get a crash course in Ryan Grubb's offense right now. But you got to see number 15 on the field for the first time, see how he fits in potentially with that quarterback group. And maybe most notably, a player that isn't under contract that is participating in minicamp the next 3 days. Robbie Chosen, previously known as Robbie Anderson, who at one point in 2020, Rob, was a 1,000-yard receiver for the Carolina Panthers. He was out on the practice field today wearing number 17, and we got to see him make a couple catches with a second-team offense from Sam Howell during this practice. And so certainly some intrigue there with the Seahawks still churning their roster and taking a look at a guy that is a proven commodity. Didn't have many catches last year, just 4 of them, but he averaged 31 yards per catch. So there's still some big play ability in Robbie Chosen, at least to make sure you don't leave the stone from being unturned and see if this guy might be somebody that you want to bring to training camp or not.
No, and I love that you led this off with that conversation here. PJ Walker, as far as just being a quarterback that has real running ability, and of course that's something that the Seahawks are going to have to face with Kyler Murray in Arizona, especially, and something that the Mike Macdonald is very used to, having coached against Lamar Jackson for all those years, and that's just the way that the NFL is now. And so, I was kind of pounding on the table a little bit in the pre-draft process. I really wanted the Seahawks to have a scout team quarterback that could run a little bit, just to give the defense a look to prepare for opponents. And so PJ Walker has that ability. Mike Macdonald kind of mentioned the fact that, oh, by the way, he beat the San Francisco 49ers as a member of the Cleveland Browns a year ago. So PJ Walker's track record speaks for itself. But again, I think that he just has such a different skill set than what Geno Smith and Sam Howell possess. And as you mentioned, Robbie Chosen is his name now. Robbie Anderson is what he played at in many NFL stops previously. I remember him at the Temple as a wide receiver that was very much an intriguing NFL prospect. The Seahawks were high on him. He has elite speed. This is a guy, I know that I believe he ran in the low 4.4s in his 40-yard dash time years ago, but he is a guy that basically reminds me a little bit of Jalen McMillan, who of course was a star for Ryan Grubb in the Huskies offense the last couple of years. This is a guy that can really get down the field, similar to Philip Dorsett and some of the other speedsters that the Seahawks have brought in over the years. I think that he gives the Seahawks a different element as far as that third or fourth or fifth wide receiver that, again, can stretch the field. And we know that Geno Smith and Sam Howell as well, heck, PJ Walker also can throw the ball deep over the top. So, again, I think that makes some sense to kind of have that conversation. Where I want to kind of shift for a moment, Corbin, is this is my first opportunity to kind of see Mike Macdonald and all of his coaches and basically see what they could do and the different body types. Who has changed since we saw them a year ago under Pete Carroll's squad? And I want to mention that Draymond Jones, for one, the physicality that he demonstrated. He looked surly. He looked pissed that he was not part of that starting defensive line. He was actually playing primarily at the outside linebacker position. He did jump inside a few times at defensive tackle, but when they were going through drills, Corbin, he was the most physical guy by far. So I was very impressed by him, considering that this is his very first day that he basically has been working with the Mike Macdonald and Adam Durde and the rest of the Seahawks' new coaching staff. So he was one that stood out to me. Darrell Taylor looks a little bit bigger and broader up top. So that is an encouraging sign as well. He's, of course, going into his free agent season. But sliding over to the offensive side of the ball, 2 skill position players I think deserve at least a little bit of a kind of a fist bump here. Just the way that they looked. You and I talked about it during the practice. DK Metcalf just looked sleeker and smoother. He looked in mid-season form. I thought he was the best player on the field, and I didn't think it was even close. But Zach Charbonnet is another one. There were multiple times, and he just exploded to and through the hole, and I kind of stood off back by the end zone. A lot of people were up on the berm, and there were times I would kind of take a peek over to the side and look over, and Zach Charbonnet was basically in my face. He had that close, that quickly to the end zone. So, again, I was encouraged by some of the guys just being bigger and broader and more physical on defense, but I was also very excited about just the pure explosiveness that I saw from 2 of the Seattle playmakers on offense that I think really could take a big step forward in Ryan Grubb's offense.
Yeah, this is the time of year, and you and I know that there's some cliches that have been thrown out there about, I'm in the best shape of my life, and that happens every time when you get to the NFL offseason. Everybody's in phenomenal shape, but there are instances where it really holds true. And DK Metcalf, I don't know what he's weighing in at, but he looked maybe 5 to 10 pounds lighter to me. And his lower body especially, he just looks really lean, and not in a bad way. Like, this guy looks like he's probably running the 4.3s like he did at the combine back in the day, maybe a little faster, but he looked more spry and in and out of his breaks just a little bit quicker. So there's got to be some reason for excitement there. And Zach Charbonnet, I've been watching him closely since the first OTA. The guy just looks like he's got a different gear this year going into his sophomore season. So you put him with Ken Walker III, who he still looks electric, nothing different with Kenny Walker. But Zach Charbonnet certainly looks like he has added a bit more burst to his game. I don't know that he's lost any weight either. Just looks like he is quicker. He is more explosive. And you could see that in the run game, albeit without pads. I'm interested to see what he looks like once we get the pads on. But those are two guys that certainly jumped out to me for that particular reason from a physique standpoint and just how good they looked on the field. I want to mention one other guy, Laviska Shenault at the receiver position. Seattle brought the former Colorado star in as a free agent this offseason. I think he's very much going to be in the mix for kick return duties. But Sam Howell and Laviska Shenault, in a day where really there was not much to speak of in terms of success in the passing game, there were a few big plays, but Laviska Shenault caught at least 4 passes from Sam Howell during the 11-on-11 periods, had a couple deep crossing routes that he snagged passes from Howell. So if you're looking for a player that looks to be developing some chemistry with your young quarterback that you brought in from Washington, Laviska Shenault looks to be that guy, and another player that physically looks quite impressive on the practice field.
No, he really does. And as you said, I mean, 4 or 5 catches. I saw one that was basically would have been a touchdown. I believe it was against Trey Brown. And he high pointed, used his height advantage over the cornerback, and basically kind of did a fairly emphatic little spike of the ball, basically, because it would have been a touchdown. But what it was celebratory, but it wasn't something that I think would kind of incur the wrath of the refs who actually were on the field for the Seahawks during this mandatory minicamp. And to me, again, that is one of the things that I really enjoyed about this particular practice. There are some differences between a Mike Macdonald practice and a Pete Carroll one. I mean, one of the things that was encouraging and intriguing to me was the fact that there was this huge screen out there. And so when players made a big play, they were able to kind of basically walk back over there, see the big play on the screen, and be able to kind of not only get some kind of coaching technique, or some help from their coaches as far as what they should be doing in their technique, so to speak, but also just kind of celebrate when they made a big play. And so there's no doubt about it. Laviska Shenault was one of the guys who made some big plays in Tuesday's practice.
When we come back, training camp is now less than 6.5 weeks away. Hard to believe, but training camp is going to be here before you know it. It's going to be a much different looking training camp. And not only when the Seahawks are in Seattle, but also apparently in Nashville. We're going to be diving into the biggest change so far heading into Mike Macdonald's first training camp as the Seahawks prepare for joint practices. We're going to dive into that coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. As always, thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks kicking off their mandatory minicamp on Tuesday. That is the final step before a 6-week break and then eventually reporting to training camp. And as we know, Rob, this has been a transformative offseason for the Seahawks. You've got a brand new coaching staff. You got tons of new personnel on offense, particularly on the defensive side of the football. The front office has largely stayed the same, but they've had to adjust how they do things with this new coaching staff and what they're wanting on both sides of the football. You also have different styles of practice. You have different ways of maintaining culture, locker room, you name it. It's just a new era in Seattle. And now there's yet another reason that Mike Macdonald is going to stand out from his predecessor, Pete Carroll. And that is the ushering in of the first joint practice in more than 15 years in training camp, the Seahawks announcing today. And this was something I knew about a few weeks ago, Rob, but we were told not to announce it until the Seahawks publicly did. But the Seahawks will face off against the Tennessee Titans in a pair of joint practices before their August 17th preseason game at Nissan Stadium. And it's interesting, when I was reporting this news today, I thought generally fans would be pretty excited based on all the questions we've gotten over the years about why don't the Seahawks do joint practices? And yet it was kind of a mixed bag, with a lot of fans being concerned about the fights that have been out there. How worth it is it to compete on a practice field against another team? But I don't know about you. This is something I have been pounding the table for Pete Carroll to do for years. I am thrilled that the Seahawks are going to be doing joint practices with the Tennessee Titans. I don't care who they're playing off against. To me, it is a great opportunity to get some really good practice reps for your starters that aren't going to be playing much or at all in preseason games. And you just have more control of the elements on the practice field.
You do have control of the elements, and that's one of the things that's exciting about it, is that this is clearly the Seahawks have a great deal of respect for the Tennessee Titans, and it's easy to understand why. Brian Callahan is the brand new head coach in Tennessee, and there's probably a lot of Seahawks fans don't know who the heck Brian Callahan is. Well, he was the offensive coordinator for the Cincinnati Bengals, a dynamic Cincinnati Bengals offense over the last couple of years. The offensive line coach is his father, Bill Callahan, who for my money is one of the absolute best offensive line coaches in all of the NFL. You want to challenge your defense, you want to challenge your defensive line, go up against somebody like this. And again, the Seahawks are going to be facing the Tennessee Titans in the preseason. And so, as you said, the Seahawks and Titans are going to be able to kind of manage who is going up against who and how these reps are going to go. Clearly, if there's fights and if there's any injuries, those are the types of things that spook you a little bit. But damn it, this is the club that need to get more physical. They need to get nastier. They need to get smarter. You have a whole different scheme that is being implemented in every single way on this team. It's like the argument that some have in the educational field. And of course, you as a former teacher, myself as a current teacher, if you're not going to test kids, how do you ever know if they actually understand it? And that's exactly what the Seahawks are doing. They're going to test their players to see if they understand before the real games begin. So I love the fact that they're doing this. And Mike Macdonald kind of mentioned the fact that the Denard Wilson, who was a defensive backs coach in Baltimore with Mike Macdonald, is now the defensive coordinator in Tennessee. That is part of the familiarity, the relationship that Mike Macdonald has with Denard Wilson, is part of what led to the Seahawks having this joint practices against the Titans. But like you, Corbin, assuming, again, big fingers crossed, there's no types of injuries, I think this is one heck of an opportunity. It's almost like a fourth preseason, or like an extra preseason game for the Seahawks to really make sure that when they face the Denver Broncos in week 1 of the real season, then they're ready to hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think that is the big selling point for me. How many times in recent years have we seen the Seahawks come out somewhat slow out of the gate, especially on the defensive side of the football? And granted, you're not going to be going down to Nashville and all out tackling the Titans running backs and receivers. They're not going to be allowing that. The Seahawks certainly are not going to be allowing that. At the same time, you can control the tempo, as I mentioned, where you can do what are called thud practices, where you're popping guys, but you're not bringing them to the ground. And the ability to do that, be able to play physical at the line of scrimmage, going against starting caliber talent in Tennessee, those are reps that you're not getting when you were playing against second and third team players at your own practices. And let's face it, Rob, you and I both played the game. I know by about the second week of training camp in high school, every single one of us hated each other because we were tired of playing against the same people on the practice field. Like, the chance to just play against somebody different, and I can speak for the starters in this regard. None of these guys, some of the veterans that came over have been in joint practices before. Lakin Tomlinson mentioned it today. He's been part of it with different teams he's played for, but a lot of the young guys for the Seahawks that have only played in Seattle, this is going to be completely a new experience for them. And I would generally assume that most of these guys are going to be really excited for that opportunity once they get to mid-August. Hey, I get to play against somebody else, when a lot of those players aren't going to be playing significant snaps or at all in the preseason. This is truly that first opportunity for them to really have that final dress rehearsal, so to speak, where They are playing legitimate football on the practice field, not all the way to the ground, but they're playing physical football against starter caliber players. And I think that is one of those things where, yes, are there risks? Absolutely. There could be an injury, though, at your own practice when you're playing against your own teammates. Why not prepare yourself for week one better by getting these quality reps? And again, a lot of it is boiling down to how the practice is structured. Macdonald talked about this today. He has been involved in good joint practices. There's been some that haven't been so good. And so I presume he's going to take those lessons learned, and Brian Callahan's going to do the same thing with the Titans. They're going to try to put together practice plans where they can really maximize what their players get in the field while also minimizing risk by controlling the tempo and stuff. I just personally think that the pros vastly outweigh the cons here, and it's something I wanted the Seahawks to do for a long time. In the Pete Carroll era, it never happened. I think that this is a really exciting opportunity for all these young players, even the veterans coming in, as a team-building experience and just getting this chance to play against other viable NFL competition in what may end up being better reps than what you're going to get in a preseason game that, quite frankly, doesn't have the controlled element to it.
Well, and speaking of team building, again, that was one of the other things that was really encouraged by what Mike Macdonald is doing. Look, Pete Carroll, in my opinion, is the greatest coach in Seahawks history. I think that he, as well as Mike Holmgren, by the way, should both be in the Hall of Fame. That said, Pete Carroll and Mike Holmgren aren't coaching this team. And so for the Seahawks fans out there who want to be excited about the future rather than the past, Mike Macdonald has to kind of establish who he is and what his program is about. And so as you just said here, with this opportunity for a joint practice, as we talked about before, the big screen up there, there's so many people who are visual learners. And so it's an opportunity to kind of just review the same play that they just saw. I think that is a great teaching point. And then finally, one of the things that Mike Macdonald talked about with the kind of splashy free agent addition. You don't often say that about a veteran left guard, but Lakeland Tomlinson joining the Seahawks, and Mike Macdonald kind of mentioned the fact that Lakeland Tomlinson is going to be part of a 9-man veteran leadership team within the Seahawks. That I think that the leadership team is something that's really intriguing. Not just team captains, 9 guys that the Seahawks coaching staff has identified as players that really are basically the face of the franchise, and the veterans that the Seahawks are looking to try to be the leaders for their squad. The fact that Lakeland Tomlinson's there, the fact that there's a leadership team just in general, to me is, again, I know everybody's going to focus in on the fact that they don't have the Seahawks pictures of the past and around the hallways. That's the silly stuff. This is the real stuff that I think is actually going to help the Seahawks basically surprise a lot of people around the league when they come out and return to the postseason, like one of our former guests, Senior Bowl executive Jim Nagy, predicted just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, this really is all about setting your own tone. And Mike Macdonald, since day one, has said, look, I respect Pete Carroll, but I am not Pete Carroll. I'm not going to try to be Pete Carroll. And he is doing things his own way. And the joint practices, that's just another element now where, hey, Pete might not have been in favor of this. And Pete had his reasons. You can respect that. Had a lot of success without doing joint practices. But Mike Macdonald's got his reasons why he thinks that they are going to be beneficial to the Seahawks. So I think this is a really exciting addition here. And as far as part of the team building aspect, hey, look, players are going to respect coaches that are genuine, and they are going to respect coaches that do things the way that they believe they should be done. And they're not trying to fake. They're not trying to be somebody they're not. Mike Macdonald's clearly not doing that. What that's going to mean for wins and losses, we'll find out when we get to September. But if he's going to struggle as a rookie head coach, it's not going to be because he's doing things somebody else's way. It's going to be his own way. And so I think this is an exciting thing that Seahawks can look forward to in mid-August, an opportunity to get some fun practices against another team and really fine-tune things for the regular season. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, very similar setup. We're going to be diving into takeaways coming out of the second mandatory minicamp practice for the Seahawks at the VMAC, offense, defense, maybe some special teams as well. You won't want to miss it. Go Hawks.